All art is political. That shouldn't be a controversial statement, but in today's political climate it has kind of become one. It's understandable if you just want to watch some escapism and not think too hard about it, but there's a big difference between not seeing subtext and outright denying its existence. The phrase, "politics should stay out of my entertainment," has become something of a dog whistle amongst right-leaning toxic fan culture, rallying against increased diversity and representation. These groups allege that their favourite properties are being ruined in order to appease social justice warriors, and that they should instead be catering to the real fans. Essentially, they just want all their old movies and TV shows to be exactly like they were when they were kids. The problem is, as much as these people claim to represent their fandoms, they all also reject the reality that their favourite films, TV shows, video games, whatever, have always been political. Now, this is a wide-ranging topic covering all kinds of different properties, but let's focus the conversation on one of the biggest: Star Wars. With one of the most fervent yet divisive fan bases in recent memory, the toxicity in the Star Wars community has only grown more and more vicious in the wake of the Disney era, with the 2017 release of The Last Jedi sparking an online backlash that still continues to this day. Amongst these various spurious criticisms is the idea that Star Wars has gotten too political, and that it should just get back to being sci-fi fun. On the one hand, The Last Jedi is a much more politically nuanced film than its predecessors. I mean, it discusses the 1%, war profiteering, the consequences of machismo, and those gosh darn centrists who keep complaining about how the system is broken, and yet always end up helping out the bad guys in the end. But to say this is some sort of out-of-the-blue shift is, well, as someone who loves both Star Wars and critical film analysis, I honestly find kind of laughable. Why exactly? Well, when you even just briefly look at the historical context of the franchise, you realize that Star Wars is one of the most political pieces of pop culture ever to gain mainstream appeal. Series creator George Lucas has never been shy about his political influences. A vocal critic of the Vietnam War and the Nixon administration, he began writing his outline for Star Wars in the midst of America's involvement in the South Asian conflict. His initial logline for the film, dated 1973, clearly outlines both the film's plot and his political leanings. A large technological empire going after a small group of freedom fighters. Gee, I wonder what that reminds me of. The original Star Wars was first released in 1977, only 2 years after the definitive end of the conflict. Whilst it is the tonal opposite of Vietnam films like Platoon or Apocalypse Now, which, incidentally, Lucas was originally supposed to direct, it is a clear allegorical reflection of the war, but one where our sympathies do not lie with the film's representation of America. Though the Galactic Empire draws its visual inspiration from Nazi Germany and feudal Japan, its political background as a dictatorship formed from the ashes of a democracy is clearly a jab at America's shift from the 1960s into the 1970s. This comparison becomes most obvious in Return of the Jedi, where the Empire are ultimately defeated by a technologically inferior race of forest dwellers who rely on guerrilla tactics. Though admittedly the Viet Cong aren't as cute or as marketable as the Ewoks. Need any more proof? Well, here's a quote from the man himself.
It was really about the Vietnam War, and that was a period where Nixon was trying to run for a second term, which got me thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships, because the democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away.
This allegorical streak then continued its way into the prequel era, in both subtle and not so subtle ways. I mean, one of the characters is literally called Newt Gunray. Newt Gunray. I mean, I wonder who Lucas is trying to compare this character to. Though the second trilogy began its development during the fun-loving 90s, by the time Attack of the Clones rolled around, America was once again finding itself in a conflict with an infrastructurally inferior nation for ill-gotten gains. Lucas himself compared the conflict in Vietnam to Iraq, and even made this blunt comparison in a New York Times interview with Maureen Dowd. Lucas's stand-in for Nixon in the original trilogy had now morphed to reflect a more contemporary form of evil. To Cheney's credit, he apparently took it on the chin. I mean, he once showed up to a GOP dinner with the literal Imperial March as his entrance music. I mean, at least he's self-aware? Whilst the prequels, especially Revenge of the Sith, have more of an air of tragedy to them in both the Greek and Shakespearean senses, the contemporary allusions are still very much there. I mean, the entire plot of the prequel trilogy is about how a democracy becomes embroiled in a war under dubious circumstances, only for it to be revealed that the whole thing is being controlled by a power-hungry puppet master who is eventually able to convince the masses into adopting a dictatorship.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Yep, no political statements in Star Wars whatsoever. None. Nothing. Totally apolitical, family-friendly fun. It's not like it's called Star Wars. Wars have never been political ever. So if the original trilogy is about Vietnam and the prequels are about Iraq, what is the sequel trilogy about, you ask? Well, the First Order are essentially neo-imperials. They're just doing everything their forebears did, but bigger and edgier, whilst on the inside they're all insecure, rage-filled man-babies basically playing fascism dress-up. Gee, I wonder who the filmmakers might be comparing these people to. So no, this political messaging is not some out-of-nowhere development brought on by some kind of agenda. If anything, it's a very natural evolution of what's been happening for decades in the series. And the reason these detractors are only noticing and complaining about it now is, well, because they were probably kids when they first watched Star Wars. I think we've all had that moment where we've suddenly fallen in love with a movie we thought was boring as a child, or finally got that adult joke from that cartoon we saw years ago.
I found prints! No, fingerprints.
Subtext and allegory in media work in very much the same way, and realizing that something you loved as a kid is even deeper than you thought should make you appreciate it even more. Denying that these themes exist and claiming that entertainment should never make you question your beliefs or worldview is honestly the very antithesis of what art should be. Oh, and to all the angry Star Wars fans ready to tell me how wrong I am in the comments, here's a quote from your so-called idol about you.
They want the films to be tough and like Terminator, and they want to be, real guy movies. And they get very, very upset and very opinionated about anything that has anything to do with being childlike, which the movies are for children, but they don't want to admit that.
So, maybe think about that before you tweet next time.